Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Freshfield's Essential Antitrust Podcast. I'm Jen Malott, a partner in the antitrust team at Freshfields in Washington and Brussels. Now, they say April showers bring May flowers, but this year, April showers are bringing what is arguably the most significant development in European merger control in over 2 decades, the European Commission's new draft merger guidelines. Now, these are the first substantive revisions to the EU's merger review framework since 2004 and 2008. And they land at a moment where, as we have discussed extensively on the podcast, there's a huge amount of geopolitical and economic flux. So we thought, let's not just tell you what's in them, let's talk about what they actually mean for deal makers, for deal planning, and for how to think about your next transaction that might be notifiable in the EU. Fortunately, I am joined by two of my partners from Brussels who have been deep in the weeds of these draft guidelines to talk about it. First, we have Andreas van Benien, a senior partner in our Brussels office. Hi, Andreas. Thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Hi, Jens. Good to be back.
And we're also joined by Paul Vandenberg, who's an antitrust partner in Brussels and Amsterdam. Thanks for being here, Paul, especially from vacation.
Thanks, Jen. And very happy to be here at this pivotal moment in EU merger control.
Great. Well, between Andreas and Paul, they have decades of experience advising on complex EU merger cases. So who better to help us just dive into it? So, Andreas, why don't we start with you? Give me one sentence. What is the headline here with these new guidelines?
Wow, Jen, this is a good question. I mean, this thing has almost 100 pages. The one sentence for me really is the Commission is trying to do two things at once. And actually, for the first time in 20 years, they have written down both of these things. And first, it is simultaneously opening a door for deals that the Commission considers pro-competitive. And at the same time, it gives itself a materially sharper toolkit to challenge those deals that it does not think pro-competitive.
Okay, well, that I think is a good frame to take this forward. And it sounds like we have a lot to discuss going in both directions. So maybe let's put the good news first. Why don't we start with the positive side of the story? Paul, for folks who have been following development of these guidelines, I know there has been a lot of discussion about efficiencies and whether we're going to see more scope for inefficiencies defense that the Commission will actually accept than has been the case historically. Is that what has happened in actuality?
Absolutely. Now that we have the draft, we can conclude that there's some real meaningful and substantive change on the efficiencies front. And for the first time, these guidelines state that merger control in the EU is a tool that supports EU competitiveness and resilience. And also that mergers can help firms reach the necessary size to compete in global markets, which is recognized as being pro-competitive. That type of language was not present in the previous guidelines. Now, on efficiencies specifically, the Commission introduced the concept, what it calls a theory of benefit framework. And this mirrors its theory of harm approach, and it is held to the same standard of proof. It is important because the Commission, through these guidelines, is committing to take the efficiency arguments as seriously as it takes its own concerns.
Got it, Paul. And I can imagine a lot of companies reading that and thinking, okay, so there's kind of a framework here, but what does that mean for me in practice? So if you have a deal in front of the Commission, what can you do now that you couldn't do before?
Yeah, first of all, there's an explicit distinction between direct efficiencies, which covers more traditional aspects such as cost savings, quality improvements. And on the other hand, what is called dynamic efficiencies, or the increased ability or incentive to invest and innovate. Now, dynamic efficiencies were hardly present in the old guidelines. And resilience, sustainability, supply chain security can now all form the basis for a recognized theory of benefit. So if your deal creates genuine scale that enables investment in critical infrastructure or secures access to critical inputs or drive innovation in a way that strengthens European competitiveness, the framework now explicitly invites you to make that case.
That's right, Paul. And can I add something to that? Because I think the framing is super important here, because the Commission is not just saying that we will listen to efficiency arguments. It is in fact actively positioning merger control as a tool that supports EU industrial policy objectives. I mean, you can say this is lip service, but what they really spend a lot of time writing out in the draft guideline is that competitiveness, resilience, defense readiness, sustainability, all these things feature prominently. It's a genuine shift in tone, and it matters because it gives parties a language to frame their deal rationale that the Commission has explicitly endorsed with this. I think this is really something we haven't read before.
And so if I'm understanding you right, Andreas, I mean, this sounds like a door that is genuinely more open to efficiencies than has been the case historically.
It is unlocked, Jen. I would not say it is thrown wide open. The underlying legal tests have not changed. The evidential burden on parties claiming efficiencies remains high. The evidence must be accurate, it must be reliable, consistent, capable of withstanding scrutiny, etc., etc. So the Commission does retain significant discretion in how it weighs the benefits against the harm that it perceives. And any benefits must obviously be substantially accruing to the same consumers who are harmed by the merger, if at all. But the framework is more receptive, nevertheless. The execution will be demanding, I guess.
Yeah, I fully agree with that, Andreas. And the other point to make is that early engagement on this topic is absolutely critical. So the Commission has explicitly said that it welcomes pre-notification dialogues on efficiencies. Just by way of illustration, the recent Airbus Air France clearance provides an example on how engaging early on efficiency claims allowed the Commission to, in its own words, assess and provide guidance on the plausibility of the efficiency claims. That's an important signal. Parties who wait until the statement of objections to deploy their efficiency case are going to find themselves behind the curve.
This all sounds relatively positive, feeling optimistic here, but you guys also mentioned an expanded enforcement toolkit. So let's hear the bad news. What are the most significant new theories of harm?
The new draft guidelines, they completely do away with the old concept that we've all been growing up with, which is the distinction between horizontal and non-horizontal mergers in terms of the guidelines, at least, is gone. The 2004 and 2008 guidelines, I can't believe it's so long ago, they actually had separate frameworks depending on whether the parties were competitors, so mainly a horizontal relationship, whether they were vertically related or in a conglomerate relationships. The new draft actually replaced all of this and presents 8 standalone theories of harm that apply to every merger regardless of type. That alone changes how we need to basically craft the narrative in the Form CO going forward and analyze how we advise clients on deal risk.
Yeah, and you see a parallel there to the US merger guidelines that came out under the Biden administration, where there was kind of a similar collapsing of prior horizontal and vertical guidelines all into one framework. So when you look at those 8 theories of harms that are set out here, what of that is genuinely new or different from the 2008 guidelines?
One which is particularly far-reaching for companies that have strong market positions relates to entrenchment of a dominant position, which is addressed in the new guidelines. And this basically means that where a dominant company acquires even a modest adjacent asset, like a data set or a certain technology or distribution channel, the Commission can now challenge the transaction on the basis that it reinforces barriers to entry and reduces market contestability. Now, this applies across all sectors, not just digital ecosystems. So any dominant company making such an adjacency acquisition, which in itself can have quite limited scope, whether in industrials, in pharma, or in energy or technology, needs to assess whether the acquired assets may have strategic importance to competitive dynamics in its core market.
That's really the most important one here, Paul. Then I think it's also important to look at this loss of investment and expansion competition theory of harm. A merger can now be challenged on the basis that it reduces the merged entity's incentive to invest, even if the merged entity proceeds with all of its planned investments. The theory is that removing a competitive threat reduces the drive to invest in the future. This will be particularly significant, obviously, in capital-intensive sectors. Look at telecoms, energy, defense, infrastructure. And then there is this loss of innovation competition, which the draft guidelines really devote quite a lot of text to. The Commission no longer needs to identify a specific product that will be delayed or withdrawn. What matters now, according to this draft, is whether the merger impedes the process of innovation rivalry. And that codifies the idea of killer acquisitions, and it does introduce the concept of reverse killer acquisitions as well. For pharma, biotech, and tech clients, this will be a key focus area.
Got it, Andreas. Theories are theories, but as Elle Woods famously told us in Legally Blonde, you also need evidence for your claims. So what is the evidentiary burden for some of these new theories?
Yeah, so Jen, so where combined shares or market concentration levels are high, I think it's fair to say that the practical burden falls on the merging parties to produce substantial evidence pointing away from a significant impediment to effective competition. Now, to be clear, the guidelines, they stop short of a formal legal presumption of competitive harm, but in practice, and in particular in complex phase 2 investigations, it may practically nevertheless create a similar dynamic. I think the challenge is reinforced by the fact that the Commission will consider that it has significant discretion to weigh the different pieces of evidence.
And the evidential burden for the parties is very high, particularly for some of those newer and less articulated theories of harm, which are obviously untested in practice. The path to clearance in high share transactions requires, like before, thorough analysis upfront, but across potentially a wider range of potential harms. So strong evidence to support any claimed benefits as well. Evidence that will need to withstand not only the scrutiny from the Commission case teams, the legal service ultimately, and the economist team in between, but also from customers and other market participants to whom the Commission will speak in the course of the investigation. That's why I think coming back to the point about early preparation is super, super important. It's really all about preparing your case really well up front.
Got it. Well, always nice to know that the lawyers and the economists will continue to be needed to work through these issues. But maybe to shift gears slightly, I don't think it will surprise anybody who listens to this podcast to hear that there is a lot of content within these guidelines aimed at digital and data-driven markets, because those have, of course, been a really significant area of focus for the Commission for quite a few years now. Paul, can you walk us through a little bit what the highlights are in that realm?
Yeah, of course. And indeed, this is really a focus area. So a few things are happening at once. First, the foreclosure framework has been unified, meaning that vertical conglomerate and what the draft guidelines call diagonal mergers are now all assessed under a single template. That last concept that I mentioned, diagonal mergers, is new. It covers transactions where there's no vertical supply relationship at all, but where one party controls a product or customer base that is primarily used by the other party's competitors. Parties can, in such circumstances, no longer argue that the absence of a supply relationship means that foreclosure is entirely off the table. Secondly, what I would call the catalog of foreclosure mechanisms has been substantially expanded. Now there is also data restriction, interoperability restrictions, delayed product releases, self-preferencing, degraded post-sale services, impeding rivals' pipeline products, which are all explicitly listed. Now, several of them reflect, as in other parts of the guidelines, the Commission's own decisions in the digital sector, including well-known cases such as Google Fitbit, Meta Customer, and Broadcom VMware, none of which existed when the previous guidelines were written in 2008.
Yeah, absolutely agreed, Paul. There's this other element which I think is practically even more significant for our clients in the digital and data-driven markets. It's actually this dynamic foreclosure incentives. This is a genuinely new concept. The Commission can now actually pursue foreclosure concerns even where the standard quantitative toolkit like diversion ratios, departure rates, margins does not identify a profitable foreclosure strategy. So the theory is that a merged entity may have strategic reasons to degrade rivals' access over time, even if it is not immediately profitable in order to entrench its market position. There's something about entrenchment that we've had already before, right?
That sounds like a pretty significant expansion of the Commission's ability to challenge digital transactions.
It is absolutely, and it leaves a significant area of ambiguity, in my view, because the draft guidelines do not specify the evidential threshold for when dynamic foreclosure incentives are sufficient to establish a significant impediment to effective competition without the support of traditional profitability analysis. There will be, in my view, a key battleground there in phase two digital cases going forward.
One point I want to add on this. So the guidelines, they also explicitly consider AI and algorithmic coordination. And the use of common pricing algorithms or AI tools is now identified as a factor that may facilitate tacit coordination. And that's important also because its relevance goes well beyond the tech sector. Sectors such as energy, financial services, retail, or any market where algorithmic pricing is prevalent will need to be assessed through this lens.
Thanks, Paul. And speaking of developments that go beyond the digital sector, I know one part of the guidelines that is particularly interesting, especially for financial sponsors and venture capital, is this so-called innovation shield. Andreas, what is an innovation shield? Why should anybody care about this?
We read about it for the first time. The Innovation Shield is, according to the draft, a structured safe harbor for acquisitions of small innovative companies and startups. So if your transaction involves a small innovator and you meet certain conditions, for example, you have overlapping R&D projects, but there are at least 3 independent R&D competitors remaining with similar competitive potential, the Commission will in principle not find a competition problem. This is genuinely new. It wasn't in the previous guidelines, but it is also quite rigid in my view. So because it prescribes very, very strict and rigid conditions for application, it provides a clearer, maybe more predictable path to clearance for acquisitions of early stage technology or life sciences businesses, provided you meet the conditions. But I also think it is quite rigid, it is quite snapshotty, and we will need to see whether it needs to be applied with more flexibility.
Yeah, Andreas, I agree. There are also some other caveats. One point is that it's unclear what kind of definition will be applied in the context of startups. There is a definition in the guidelines, but then elsewhere in the guidelines, it is stated that it depends on the industry that we're talking about. So this is something that will require further clarification. Also note that DMA designated digital gatekeepers cannot rely on this shield, and that is a deliberate signal that the largest platform operators will face heightened scrutiny regardless of the target size.
And the conditions for the shield are novel and untested, so careful upfront analysis is essential. That being said, for the right transactions, it may provide a meaningful protection against full-blown innovation competition scrutiny, which is important. So this is a genuinely positive development for startup acquisitions in Europe, if broadly applied.
Got it. Well, we're getting towards the end of our time, but there are a couple of other aspects of the new guidelines that I do want to make sure we talk about briefly. Paul, talk to me about what the new guidelines say about labor market effects.
Yeah, so this is very interesting because for the first time, a merger between employers can now be assessed for its impact on workers' wages and employment alternatives, not just in the context of effects for downstream consumers. Now, the Commission has made clear that it will only look at competition effects, so not at effects of corporate restructurings as such, but it is clearly a new dimension that will be taken into account. It is most relevant for transactions in sectors with specialized or concentrated hiring markets. And one can think of the tech sector, healthcare, defense, and professional services. Parties in those sectors will need to assess whether the merger materially reduces workers' employment alternatives in the labor markets concerned. And this is really a new analytical angle that simply did not exist under the prior guidelines.
And Andreas, how about minority shareholdings? Are those addressed?
Yes, they are. Non-controlling minority shareholdings and common institutional ownership are now treated as potential standalone competition concerns. On the non-controlling minority shareholdings, I think there is some case law out there where the Commission has been testing these concerns. Here now, there is still a 5% de minimis threshold for the standalone analysis, but sub-threshold stakes can still be relevant as contributing factors. As to common ownership, where the merging firms and their rivals are all, or many of them, minority owned by the same institutional investors, the Commission has explicitly stated that standard HHI calculations may understate harm and may need to be adjusted. For financial sponsors and institutional investors with broad portfolio holdings across specific sectors, even if only minorities, an audit of existing shareholdings, even if only minorities, is now really going to be part of the pre-signing checklist because this needs to be included in the feasibility analysis. Is a new due diligence step that did not previously arise in that same manner in EU merger control.
Got it. Well, clearly a lot here for us antitrust junkies to continue to nerd out on and discuss in the coming days and weeks. But maybe before we go further down the rabbit hole, let's close this one out with some practical takeaways. So, Paul, if you are an M&A lawyer or corporate development person listening to this, what should you be doing differently as a result of these draft guidelines?
Yeah, first, and Jen, we really cannot stress this enough. The theory of harm mapping needs to start at deal origination and not just at the moment of notification. The breadth of the new framework means that competitive risks which would not previously have been on the radar, such as, and we've talked about it in this podcast, loss of investment competition, entrenchment, diagonal foreclosure, dynamic foreclosure incentives, those new theories may now be decisive. And getting ahead of those early is really critical in getting your deal cleared.
Yeah, and that ties in the second point, Paul. Build your efficiency and benefit case before pre-notification. The Commission has explicitly said that it welcomes early engagement on efficiencies, and the recent Airbus Air France example confirms this as well. So frame the deal rationale around the Commission's own language: scale, resilience, innovation, investment, global competitiveness, and then make sure your evidence is accurate, reliable, consistent, and will withstand scrutiny, not just from the case team and the economists, but also from customers and other market participants who will be consulted on your deal.
Yeah, and third, I would just highlight again for financial sponsors and institutional investors in particular, do audit your portfolio shareholdings before signing, because the new content on minority shareholdings and common ownership that Andreas referred to are now important factors to consider. And it requires upfront analysis that simply was not part of the EU merger control process up until now.
Well, I think that is all we have time for today. But Andreas, Paul, thank you so much for hopping on at such short notice to discuss these new guidelines, which just came out in draft form today. I mean, maybe if I can summarize, I think the framework has some silver linings for deal doers. It has innovation shield, explicit recognition of investment, innovation and resilience as positive parameters of a framework. And those sound like they create room to tell real pro-competitive stories for deal makers. But the framework also leaves some significant questions unanswered and new theories of harm that are untested, and we'll have to see how the commission applies those within its very wide discretion as time goes on. I know folks are following this development closely. We have published some detailed written analysis on this in our blog series. You can find links to those in the show notes, and we'll be sending around more detailed client briefings. And you can always approach anyone in our antitrust team to learn more about this. The commission is going to apply these principles from now ahead of formal adoption, and these aren't theoretical questions. So we expect the commission to start assessing these in live transactions as of day one from when the guidelines take effect. So lots to continue to talk about, and we will keep breaking it down as developments hit here on Essential Antitrust, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks for listening.